Good afternoon, Chevra. Hi, good to see everybody. For those watching on YouTube after the class, you missed the schmoozing session. What happens when you don't log on? You can't schmooze. But we're glad you're joining us, glad you're learning with us, and glad to see you all here. So thanks for coming and thanks for being here. We're going to learn today from a different rebbe that we haven't learned from so far, the HaShuva. Rebbe Mordechai Yosef of Ishbitza. Mordechai Yosef Lehner of Ishbitza. If you don't know Ishbitza, that's okay. We'll learn about it now. So just a little bit of a background about the HaShuva, about Reb Mordechai Yosef. He's an he's a little bit of an interesting character. He learned under two really well-known rebbes. First, Reb Simcha Bunam of Peshischa, who gets quoted a lot nowadays. He's become kind of a well-known rebbe, and the Kotzker Rebbe. If you guys don't know anything about the Kotzker Rebbe, there's one thing which we'll get to, which you might know. So the Kotzker led a Hasidic group, and Mordechai Yosef was one of his students. And around 1840, on Simchat Torah, something happened between Reb Mordechai Yosef and the Kotzker. There's a lot of conflicting stories about what happened. One interpretation is that Reb Mordechai Yosef was supposed to lead the sixth Hakafa on Simchat Torah, and the Kotzker Rebbe gave it to someone else, and Reb Mordechai Yosef got offended and stormed out with his students. That's one version of the story. Another is that Reb Mordechai Yosef was told to leave. The Kotzker told him to get out, so he left. He did what he was told, and then he still got criticized for it afterwards. A third version is, I'm still figuring this one out too. He put his left shoe on first. You're actually supposed to put your right shoe on first, and then your left one. And then when you take off your shoes, you're supposed to take off your left shoe first and then your right one. Learned that recently in Halakha. But the Reb Mordechai Yosef put on his left shoe first on Simchat Torah, never went to the Hakafa, and the Kotzker gave him permission to leave, and he left, and people still criticized him for leaving anyway. It's somewhat unclear if this was the motivating factor, but if there's one thing you know about the Kotzker, it's that he spent the last 19 years of his life in isolation. He locked himself in his study room and never came out. And his students weren't allowed in. He never came out. It was just kind of, they would put food outside the door. He'd open the door, take it, and that was pretty much all he had. And that was how he spent the last 19 years of his life. The Kotzker himself was an interesting guy. He was pretty fiery. There's a story about him that he never published his own teachings. Why did he never publish his own teachings? Anybody want to take a stab? He didn't publish his own teachings because he was worried that his students, that the Kotzker Hasidim, worked so hard during the week that after services on Shabbat, they'd go sit down to read his books and they'd fall asleep from exhaustion from during the week, and the book would fall on the floor, and that chas v'shalom, that the book fell on the floor, so he didn't want that to happen, so he never published his books.
See, I was going to say because he sounds a little crazy, so I guess I would have been right.
So the Mei HaShiloach, Reb Mordechai Yosef, after he left, took his Talmidim with him and starts his own group in Ishpitza. And he fights back a lot against some of the Kotzker teachings and some of that fire that the Kotzker brings. Mei HaShiloach refers to the waters of salvation. So you, in some sense, you can think of the Mei HaShiloach as the water to the Kotzker's fire. And the two kind of balance each other out in some ways. He deals, the Mei HaShiloach deals a lot with questions and doubts around faith. We'll look a little bit at that today, as well as he also deals with the issue of anger a lot, which gives you some sense of what he probably dealt with under the Kotzker. So that's kind of your introduction to the Mei HaShiloach today. For the record, one of my teachers, Reb Mibi Feigelson, happened to have lunch with a descendant of the Kotzker Rebbe years ago. And she tells the story that she was having lunch with the descendant and she mentioned the Mei HaShiloach, and the woman spat on the ground and went, "Ugh, Ishpitza." So 200 years later, there's still some bad blood between Kotzker and Ishpitzer.
Oh, time to carry a grudge.
Do the Kotzker Hasidim still exist? Do they have a group somewhere?
I don't think they have a group necessarily. I don't think Kotzk is really around anymore. They kind of died out. But you know, you can still people can still trace their lineage down. They're still descendants of the Rebbe. There's not really a group anymore. So that's your short introduction. Any questions before we jump in?
Why do we put on or take off our right shoe before our left or whatever?
No, put on.
Put on the right shoe first.
You want your right shoe
do
on
that, by
longer
the way.
because right
I always
right
do.
is the side of strength, and the Talmud has a little mention of this. I can't remember the exact reasoning. I learned it probably about 2 years ago, and I can't quite remember the exact reasoning. Maybe 3 now.
So how do you put your shoes on, Rabbi?
I will admittedly say I usually put my left sock and then my left shoe and then my right sock and my right shoe.
Are you left-handed?
No, but that's just kind of that's just kind of how I do it. If I'm really thinking about it, I'll be like, oh no, maybe I should put my right shoe on, and then I'll switch, but not always.
I always put my right shoe on.
Yeah,
So
Then I don't take it off.
you're a Talmudist.
No, I
so welcome.
heard that.
Welcome to the Mei HaShiloach. We're going to take a little look at today on Parashat Bishalach. So if somebody wants to start by reading the verses, we'll start with the verses, and then we'll see where he's going to go from there.
Well, I'll read, Rabbi. When Pharaoh sent away the people, God did not lead them along the way by the land of the Philistines, even though it was closer, because God said, lest the people regret leaving Egypt when they see battle and they return to Egypt. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the Israelites swear, saying, God will surely notice you. You shall bring up my bones from this place with you.
Good. Questions, comments, thoughts?
Well, it's two separate, the two sentences
Don't go together.
don't go together. They have two separate.
There is one verse separating them, but not super important for the teaching, which is why I didn't put it in there.
I have a question, Rabbi. Okay. So this particular teaching is from this particular rabbi, but I noticed whenever they bring up a parsha, this is the third time I've heard this mentioned, that when the Pharaoh sent away the people, God did not lead them along the way by the land because it was closer, because he didn't want them to go turn around and go back to Egypt. How is it that the same thing is repeated in different, I mean, it's the same, I don't understand.
Well, this is actually the Torah. This is what the Torah says.
Okay, so
This
that's
is
the
a
reason it
direct
keeps
quote.
popping up. Okay,
Yeah, that's
Okay.
why it pops up, because this is a direct quote of Exodus chapter 13, verse 17.
okay.
And it's interesting in that you have a direct quote of God, which does not seem to be revealed to anybody. It doesn't say, God said to Moses, bless the people. It says that, you're getting like insight into God's inner thoughts without actually God telling anything, which is kind of an interesting way to look at this. God thought to God's self, lest the people regret leaving, and when they see battle and they return to Egypt. That's God's rationale, but it doesn't say God's talking to anybody. But yes, this is a direct quote. And then other questions, comments, thoughts before. So when the people left, there's some fascinating midrashim on this, but when the people left, they explicitly take Joseph's bones with them, and Moses stops to grab them on the way out before they leave. So, Suzanne, you brought up the question. So do you want to read the next one?
Okay. This is what I was trying to say.
Exactly.
Why are these two verses juxtaposed to each other? When Moses, our rabbi, saw that even after they were redeemed, still Pharaoh went after them, a doubt arose in his mind that perhaps the Israelites still had not completed their goal of wholeness. Maybe they were still connected to Pharaoh, perhaps because of the long time they had spent in Egypt. Also, when he saw that God did not lead them along the way by the land of the Philistines, lest the people have regret, he understood that they had not completed their purification.
Okay, what's he saying? So there's a question here. Why are these two verses next to each other? Suzanne even asked that question. So same question as the HaShuva. And what's the beginning of his answer?
So what I see is that the people aren't, it's maybe like a prelude, like a showing of the hand that the people are going to wander for a long time in the desert, that they're not ready to be free people, but that God will ultimately bring them to the promised land, going back to what it says, God will surely notice you. And that's why they brought the bones out, that it's going to be a long journey to get there to their place where we're actually free, and God will lead us to their place. Or not.
No,
I
that was
like your
good.
reaction.
Well, my reaction was I had to cough, so I was trying to mute myself so I could cough. And you didn't have to hear it. No, I think, look, here you are, here the Israelites are at a moment of great redemption. Finally, after 10 plagues, Pharaoh relents and tells the people to leave. And Moses takes them out, and they are leaving Egypt. And what does he realize?
He needs the Israelites.
Maybe the Israelites aren't ready. Maybe they're not done with what they're supposed to be doing yet. Maybe they're not spiritually full, they're spiritually complete to leave and to be free people.
Right, because it mentions that they're still connected to Pharaoh, as if they were the bonds of slavery are still upon their hearts and minds in a way.
Yeah, and Pharaoh again changes his mind and goes after them. So Moses kind of has this realization that we're supposed to be redeemed, but maybe the people aren't spiritually ready yet. And then when God says, I'm going to take them the long way rather than the most direct way, because I'm afraid they might regret leaving at the first sight of war, Moses understands these people aren't ready for this journey spiritually. There's something going on here that he starts questioning where they are and what they're supposed to be doing.
And I'm not saying the destination is not important, but sometimes very often the journey is the goal. The journey is, in very real sense, the destination.
Yeah, and there's a number of commentators who make the point that, contrary to many a joke, it's not that the Israelites spent 40 years in the wilderness because Moses was a man and refused to stop and ask for directions. That's not why they spent 40 years in the wilderness. Many commentators make the point that there's a spiritual maturity that needed to happen between the Exodus and the entrance into the Holy Land. And that people, you have people who were slaves for 400 years. They don't know what to do with being free now. And so much of that time in the wilderness is spent trying to transition them from a mentality of slavery to a mentality of freedom. Or maybe put differently, but more accurately, a mentality of being servants of a human king to being servants of the divine king. And what does it mean to serve God rather than serve a person? That's really what the time in the wilderness is trying to do.
In a practical sense, they have to become self-reliant and resourceful. And what better place to do that than the desert?
Sort of, except they're not all that self-reliant either. God has to provide for them constantly.
Well, not yet, but
That's the goal.
But they have to learn that there's a different mentality in who they are supposed to be now, that they're not there at this moment. It's going to take them 40 years to get there. And it's going to take a lot of struggle and fight to get there too.
Can we argue, though, that they actually never make that transition, that an entire generation has to die out in the desert before the next generation does have the maturity and the mentality to not be a slave, but to be a free-thinking human and to believe in God?
Yeah, so here's kind of the question, and it's not an easy question to answer. Was the plan for that generation of the Exodus to transition from slavery in Egypt to freedom and serving God, and they were just incapable of doing it? Or is it that the entire plan was that you needed a generation that was not born into slavery to be able to make that transition? Not a clear answer, but there is something there to be said that generation was never able to make that transition, and it took the next generation, who was not born in Egypt, who did not know Egyptian slavery, to be able to live in the Holy Land and to be able to serve God in the way that God imagined. Sometimes it takes the next generation to break the cycles that we are used to.
Okay, so we still have the question about the bones. We have
not gotten there yet.
The bones yet, but
We'll
so this is a long time after Joseph died, right? So I don't know where he was buried at, before they left, where he was buried, and how did the people of Israel, did they in some way worship him? I mean, was this in a special place that that he had within their society? And then when the Jews are leaving, they had to take his bones, but there are other bones, there are other Jews that died and still they're going to leave those folks in Egypt, potentially to be desecrated, by the Egyptians after they left. So,
but doesn't Joseph say, please bury me?
Right. Joseph makes an explicit plea to be buried, to eventually be buried in the ancestral tomb in the cave of Machpelah. But you bring up a good question, which the Midrashim tried to deal with, which is, where was Joseph's bones in the meantime? For where have they been for the last 400 years of slavery?
right.
There's some interesting Midrashim about it. One has a woman named Serach bat Asher, who is a daughter of Jacob's son Asher, who lived the entire time and knew where Joseph's bones were buried so that she could tell them where it was, and help and make sure that his bones left with the Israelites. And then she goes on the Exodus with them, and she continues her life for a while after that. There's another great one. I don't remember if it's the same connected Midrash, but there's another one where bones were at the bottom of the Nile, and when the time came, they lifted to the top as a reminder, and I think Moses called out to the bones, and the bones rise from the bottom of the Nile and show up, and then he knows to take them. And there are lots of really fascinating Midrashim about Joseph's bones, but we're not going to get too far down that rabbit hole. But it is an interesting question of, you have to ask that question. It's been 430 years, and the people still knew where Joseph's bones were. I don't know, but it is a challenging question.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Go.
Well, I know you want to get off this, but I'm just curious, why would he not make it into a pyramid because he wasn't an Egyptian? He had such a high position that you
I
would
don't
think.
know. The Torah
We have
tells
a
us that he
Midrash
was
about
embalmed, and I believe embalmed and buried, but it doesn't really tell us much else about him. It doesn't give a location. It doesn't talk about anything else. Towards the very end of Genesis, Joseph dies, and it mentions that he was embalmed according to Egyptian custom, and he was buried, but that's pretty much all it tells us. But we'll come back to Joseph's bones. We're going to deal with Moses a little more first, and then we'll come back to Joseph. So somebody wants to take the next paragraph.
Sorry about
I'll do it.
Please.
It is said, anyone whose fear of sin precedes their wisdom is enduring.
Good. In case you're interested, I gave the full quote of the Mishnah from Pirkei Avot at this point below. That's just the beginning of the Mishnah, or the quote, but I give you the full one there, which is, you can see anyone whose wisdom precedes their fear of sin, the wisdom is not enduring. And then there's another version about deeds and wisdom, which follow the same parallel structure. But continue.
Okay. This means that there are times that we find that the Holy One hides God's actions and conceals God's intention from people so that people do not know the will of the Holy One in this matter. This is similar to what we see here, as Moses wondered why Hashem did not lead the people along the way of the land of the Philistines.
Okay. I hope somebody else here has had this experience where they're like, what is God thinking in this moment? I have no idea. Yes? Anybody? See one head shaking?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not alone. That's good. Things happen sometimes, and things work, and we're like, what's the purpose? What is the means? Why is this happening this way? What is going on? Why would God do this? And God doesn't, God's not going to tell all of us what's going on. It seems God doesn't even tell Moses why God's choosing to go this way. That God is hiding God's intention, and Moses is left wondering, why are we going this way? I don't know. I don't know what is happening right now, and I'm stuck here trying to figure it out.
What is it? I mean, to me, it could be an opportunity to either, let them figure it out for themselves, or just trust God. But maybe, maybe I'm misunderstanding it, because if he hides his intention, they're going this way, and I don't know, do they assume that God is leading them without his revealing why? And their job is just to trust him and go. I'm not sure I'm understanding it completely.
Well, good. I think he's saying that, I think what the Mei HaShiloach is trying to teach here is there are times we don't understand, and what are we supposed to do in those moments?
Mm.
There are times we don't understand what God is trying to do or why God is doing what God is doing. So what do we do in those moments? And he tips his hand a little bit, because he gives this quote from Pirkei Avot, that anyone whose fear of sin or awe of sin precedes their wisdom is enduring. He's going to cycle back to that, but what's he kind of alluding to here?
Well, they got the 10 Commandments and they said, we'll do, and before they knew what it was.
Good, not quite where he's going with this, but what's kind of the allusion here is that your awe, your fear precedes your wisdom. Your awe of God needs to precede your understanding of God. So he's kind of tipping his hand a little bit here, saying, there are times we don't know, there are times we don't understand, there are times it's not clear, and we have to maintain that kind of awe of God as a way of being able to move forward despite our lack of understanding.
So even though Moses didn't understand why they were going the long way around rather than A to B, his fear and his awe of God, he didn't have to understand it, he just had to trust it.
Well, that's kind of the direction we're going.
Okay.
But let's maybe read a little more. So if somebody wants to read the next one, now he's going to try to tie the pieces together more or less.
I'll do it. The advice in this situation, if a person sees that the Holy One is acting towards him or her in a hidden way, then one should not try to outsmart the situation. Rather, one should focus on performing the mitzvot simply and include the attribute of fear and awe. This is implied by Moses took the bones of Joseph. The path of the righteous is that he associates the lacking with himself or herself when something causing doubt happens. This is why it says he took the bones of Joseph. For when a person finds something lacking in himself or herself, that person can begin to bring into himself or herself the attribute of fear and awe. The bones of Joseph allude to this, for the attribute of Joseph HaTzadik was fear and awe, as is explained in the verse, lest God rush like fire on the house of Joseph. This relates to anyone whose fear of sin precedes their wisdom, which is the attribute of Joseph Hasidic.
Good. I'm still struggling a little understanding this verse from Amos, but I think we can get more out of the rest of the teaching regardless. So what's he kind of saying here?
If you,
In
even
case
if
you
you
wanted to
don't
see my other
understand why
footnote.
you should do something, or especially if you feel that God is not understanding you, you should just go ahead and do the thing. And maybe, do the mitzvah and not worry about why or what. And but I think it's reaching when to say that fear and awe were Joseph's characteristics.
Because
I guess people were afraid of him and in awe of him. He wasn't fearful and afraid.
so fear of sin primarily. So why is Joseph, by the way, why is Joseph called Hasidic? Why is Joseph relate compared to having a fear of sin?
Didn't he? Because okay, I'm when Potiphar's
Wife,
You froze there. Tony.
there's some mid was yeah. Oh, can you hear me? Hello, hello.
Now
Can you
we
hear me?
yes.
Okay.
Now we can.
So there, when Potiphar's wife was trying to seduce him, and I can't remember the exact midrash, but he ran so fast that's the reason that she had his garment, because I can't remember it. But anyways,
That's not even midrash. That's what the Torah tells us. She
Okay.
ran away and she grabbed onto his garment.
She
as he
grabbed
ran
onto his
away
coat.
and ripped it off of him.
right. And so I'm thinking that the fear and awe that he had, he was put into the pit, he was sold to Egypt, he was put in prison, but he never like tried to figure out what God was doing. He just went along with it and did what he was supposed to do. He never questioned it.
Good.
He just
So
went with it.
a lot of Joseph's praise, they actually tie into this incident with Potiphar's wife. Because in some sense, Joseph is put into a very vulnerable situation. He is alone in the house with his master's wife. There's nobody else around, and she really, really, really wants him. He could very easily take advantage of that situation, sleep with her, and nobody would know the difference. But rather, he refrains himself out of this fear of sin, out of a fear of transgressing, knowing that it's the wrong thing to do. And out of his righteousness, he doesn't follow through with it. In fact, he runs away as quickly as he can. By the way, for the same reason, I'm not going to pull it up, but if we've looked at the spherotic chart in Kabbalah with like the different circles that go form a tree or a person, Joseph with this incident is often associated with Yesod, which is the divine phallus, because he is the one who controls his sexual urges in this way. So I think that's kind of where the fear of sin is coming from, is his ability to know what is wrong and refrain from doing it, even when there's no chance of getting caught. so that's the connection I think there with Joseph. But what's the Mehashiloach trying to say when you're in these kinds of situations where you don't understand what God's trying to do?
Well, there's something down at the bottom that said smart aleck, and I was thinking that it just meant up at the top where it says one should not try to outsmart the situation.
Yes. So
Stop trying to figure.
the word in Hebrew, lahid hakem,
Mhm.
means can mean a couple things. It can mean to make oneself wise, but it can also has a connotation of like either outsmarting a situation or outsmarting somebody, but it can also mean to be a smart aleck.
So I think it just means if you see yourself in that situation, you need to try to stop figuring it out, stop trying to outsmart God. In other words, trying to stop out. You know how when you say sometimes you're overthinking the situation? I think in this point, that's what it's saying. Stop trying to overthink God. Stop trying to, because you're not going to figure it out.
Good.
Stop
Don't try
trying
to
to
outsmart God. Don't try to figure it out. But what do you do instead?
Instead, you perform the mitzvah, which is, in my understanding of this, is you continue to have your on fear of God and do the right thing, regardless of your understanding of what is going on.
Right. So
That's
there's
what
a
I'm figuring out.
discussion in the Talmud about whether it's better to study mitzvot or to do mitzvot. Like, how important is it to understand what's going on versus doing it? And one of the arguments is you do it and then you understand why. That, and I think that's a little bit where he's coming at from too, is that the action, rather than saying, I don't understand, and therefore I'm not going to do anything until I understand. Well, no, rather you keep acting even when you don't understand. And that's how you maintain relationship. That's how you maintain faith with God, is by acting even when it doesn't make sense to act.
But how do you know that you're acting in the right way? Because we already have assumed that we don't understand what God is doing in that moment. So how do you know that what you're doing in response to that is the quote right thing to do? I mean, I have some children who, when they don't know what to do, they tend to go to a rabbi and ask, oh, what should I do here? Instead of just kind of acting on their own free will. So I kind of have a bit of a problem with this.
Because
you're giving up your agency, you're giving up your choice in things, because I mean, how are we going to know what God wants us to do? And circling back even farther to a question you asked earlier, have you ever been in a situation where you didn't understand what God was doing? Well, aren't we in that situation every day when there are mass killings every day, when Tyree Nichols gets beat to hell? I mean, everywhere you look, you could question, what is God doing?
Good. And exactly. And so what I think he's saying is, I actually don't think he's saying you're giving up your agency. I think what he's saying is when you don't understand and and doubts are starting to creep in your mind because of it, because you don't understand, you make the conscious choice to continue doing mitzvot. You continue following the commandments. You continue follow the path, even when it doesn't always make sense to you. And in a sense, you're kind of hoping that by maintaining that relationship, you are able to come eventually to some understanding of it. You might not have it in the moment, but if you disconnect from the relationship altogether, you're never going to understand it. So what do? You keep acting with the mitzvot, and the model for this is actually Moses. Moses comes to a place where he says, I'm not sure I understand what we're doing or why we're doing it. Maybe we're not ready. Maybe spiritually we're not there. Maybe we're still connected to Pharaoh. Maybe we're going the wrong way. And I'm going to take the bones of Joseph with me, even nevertheless. Because we are leaving, and I'm going to continue doing what I know I need to be doing. There is a little bit of a play on words here too, where the Hebrew words for bones are atzmot, or etzem is a singular, atzmot, and himself is etzmo, as in like the self is, like, your bones are the self, because they kind of create the structure of the body, the related words. So in some sense, there's a spiritual part here too, where when you're in that place of doubt, you take your own bones with you and move them with you. You take that doubt with you and you continue serving even when you're in doubt. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but I don't see how we ever get out of doubt.
I think his point, and again, as I mentioned at the beginning, he deals with questions of doubt a lot. So this isn't the one and only answer. And I think if we were to sit here and study the entire book, you'd see he comes back to this question over and over again. But I don't think you necessarily get out of doubt. And I'm not sure he believes that you're going to get out of doubt. I think he understands that doubt is part of the relationship. And you need to stay in the relationship nevertheless. Because if you leave the relationship, you're not going anywhere. Like spiritually, you're stuck. There's nowhere else to go.
So is it, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I would just, is the performance of the mitzvot, the actual, obeying, the commandments, by doing that over and over, because a lot of these things you do every day, maybe several times a day, the understanding, creeps in, and by doing it, you learn it, you internalize it, you have a consciousness of it. I was also thinking that maybe, well, anyway, I won't go that way, and then I guess maybe this is a Kabbalistic view of it, but by doing the mitzvot, you are creating divine sparks that don't exist if you don't do them. So you're, trying to create sparks, divine sparks that are going to, lead us toward the Mashiach at some point. Does that make any sense? I don't know.
Yeah, no, yes. I'm not sure that's exactly where he's going with it, but yes. I think that there is a Kabbalistic way, and I think in some way, I think that, Chabad and the Ari would probably agree with you. But I think there's a level here of, and we've talked about this a little bit before, is that there's two balancing forces in a relationship. One is the force of ahava, which is love. And the force of ahava brings the relationship together, it brings you closer. And Hasidic thought, and Kabbalah to some extent has it too, is that there is such a thing as too much love and too close together. Because if you merge into one, then you lose your sense of self. The opposite the other force then is yirah, which is fear or awe, which is a force that kind of pulls you apart. It's where you acknowledge you are a separate individual who can't always understand the other individual. And so I think in this relationship, part of what he's saying is, in this divine human relationship, it's okay to have that doubt. It's okay to not understand everything God is asking of you. But you stay in the relationship by performing mitzvot, and you include the attribute of yirah, of awe. And by doing so, you kind of accept, I'm not going to understand this because I'm not God. I'm never going to fully understand what God is asking because I'm not God. And if I was, then I would kind of cease to be myself. So there's this pull and this push and pull that goes on in even in the divine human relationship between ahava and yirah, love and awe, where we're kind of trying to balance. We want to come closer, but not too close. So what do? We stay in the relationship, we perform mitzvot, but we accept with awe that we're not going to fully understand what's going on either. Questions, comments, thoughts?
Mickey, unmute yourself.
When we read from week to week what's going on in the Torah, it's hard to think that these people had no relationship with God. They have no history. At least today, we have a history with God. And it's not always a good history, but it's a history nevertheless. So I think it's easier to understand today what we should and should not do rather than the people in the desert. They have no basis, no anything except Moses.
Yeah, and to some extent, that's kind of the point of the Torah, right?
Right.
If you want to look at it spiritually, that's the point of the Torah and of the rabbinic commentary and the Hasidic commentary and the Midrashim and the halachic commentary and this and that, is that it provides us with a path to spiritual connection that we didn't know before. There's a principle in rabbinic thought of, every generation stands on the shoulders of the previous one. Because, and in fact, halachically, you can't contradict a previous generation because on some level, they're closer to the revelation, but on the other hand, you've got to build on what they already know. So on some level, we keep building up based on historic experience. If you want to look at it from a less spiritual way, that's why we study history, right? We learn both from the successes and the mistakes of our families, our ancestors, our generations, our countries. We learn what happened in the past so that we know what to do in the future. But yes, I can imagine it would be hard for them not having that background and having to figure it out on their own.
But then on the other hand, I'm sort of with Stephen where it might make it harder to be in that relationship to maintain that relationship with God, to be to continue from a position of faith and faith in God when one sees the history of the world and what's happening here day to day. And, while I understand what we just studied, I do see Stephen's point on how difficult it is to continue to be in that relationship. And maybe that is the challenge of the teaching, but.
So I'll say two things in response to that. I'm going to take this off, but if anybody wants to come back to the text, just let me know. I can quickly put it back on. I'll say two things. I think one, actually I'll say three things. One, yes, that is a challenge. Two, we face this in all of our relationships. And I'll use my relationships as an example. There are times where, my kids will do something. I'm like, what were you thinking?
I was
Like,
Really?
why would you do that? But do I understand what they are doing? No, but does that mean, but I still stay in the relationship. I still work, I still take care of them, I still feed them, I still put them to bed, right? Like, we stay in the relationship, even though we don't always understand what the other person is doing. I've had friends where I'm like, I don't understand what you're doing. Like, that's a horrible decision. But you know what? I don't understand it, and it's your decision, and I'm going to sit here and still be your friend because of it. So I think there's a level of that as well. And third thing I'll say is, and we've talked about this a little bit on and off, is I'm not one who actually believes that all the bad things in the world are God's fault. Why is God making bad things happen? Well, God's not making bad things happen. People are making bad things happen, and we have the choice to stop making bad things happen. And God wants us to stop making bad things happen, but we have free will and we have the choice of what we're going to do. So, and unfortunately, sometimes we actively choose against God's will.
I will agree with you on your point number 3, but with respect to your point number 2, the difference between a relationship with a friend or a relationship with your children compared to a relationship with God, we expect God to be just and merciful and perfect. I mean, of course, I expect my kids to make mistakes. I mean, I expect myself to make mistakes, but that's not, we have a higher expectation of God.
So is that God's fault?
That we
Or
have
we
that
have a higher expectation of God?
I wouldn't say it's God's fault, but it's certainly, I would think, something that God expects us to have. I mean, he won't even let us see his face.
So I think I've said this before. Rabbi Brad Artson, one of my teachers, had this saying that he'd say, all knowing, all good, all powerful. You can choose 2 out of the 3. If you want all 3, you're going to have a philosophical problem because it's never going to work. You can't have a God who is all 3 of those, because otherwise philosophically it never works.
But don't we say the 13 attributes of God? I mean, I don't know.
And what are the 13 attributes? Rachum v'chanun, God is compassionate and merciful.
slow to anger.
Erech hapayim, patient. Rav chesed ve'emet, full of kindness and truth.
Mm-hmm.
Nowhere does it say, nowhere in those 13 attributes is God perfect.
Anybody who has those 13 attributes is pretty close.
Well, you know where we end up, how we ended up with this idea of a perfect God.
No.
Aristotle. What's one of Aristotle's arguments? Going back to your ancient philosophy classes.
Too long ago.
Part of Aristotle's argument is that there exists this concept of perfection, but anytime we try to bring that concept into reality, it's inherently imperfect. So there is somewhere this vision of an ideal table. Every table that we try to create is inherently an attempt to bring that ideal vision in, but it's inherently an interpretation of that vision and it doesn't actually reach the ideal table.
Mhm.
Similarly, therefore, there has to be an ideal person. There has to be an ideal world. There has to be this kind of image of perfection of what a person or a world should look like, and we attribute that to God. And in some sense, if we are created in God's image, God is the ideal person, and we are imperfect creations, imperfect impersonations of that perfect image. Everybody follow that? I think it's a syllogism. I could be wrong. I never took a logic class. I just took philosophy classes, and I made it up as I went. That was a joke, people. That's where we start to get this imagery of God having to be all perfect, all good, all knowing, all powerful. Like that's where a lot of these imageries come from, is actually Greek philosophy. The Torah doesn't really talk about God being perfect. In fact,
God gets mad a lot, and
God gets angry.
He wants to kill everybody all the time.
In fact, if you read, and Rabbi Artson brings this case in also. If you read the story of Noah, there's a really fascinating line in there where, what does it say? Just before, it's the very end of Parashat Bereshit, which means I think it's end of Genesis chapter 5, if I remember correctly.
About Noah being righteous in his age?
Before that,
Okay.
it says, God looked at the world and regretted the world, regretted God's creation. If you are perfect, you do not have regret. And by the way, it's the same word that's used here in the Torah here, where it talks about that God is worried that the Israelites are going to regret leaving Egypt. It's the exact same word. God regretted, nachem. The Torah does not seem to have this imagery of a perfect deity. In fact, it seems to be a God that is learning and developing in relationship with God's creation at all times, which is a keystone to Rabbi Artson's process theology, is that God is in process of growing and learning and developing with us, in relationship with us. We can read that book down the line if you want, but other questions, comments, thoughts? I threw a whole lot at you at once there.
Well, just one last thing. I think that I understand that God gave human beings' free will and, self-awareness so that we could choose to find our way to God. If we don't have free will, we don't have self-awareness, there's no spiritual journey to be had.
Correct. If you don't believe in free will, then a lot of life just doesn't make sense at all, because everything that was destined to happen is going to happen anyway. So it doesn't really matter what we choose. In fact, our choices already are predestined. Just by the way, this is part of the problem with God's all-knowingness. That if God knows everything, then God already knows what we're going to choose, and God already knows what's going to happen. So it doesn't really matter what we choose or what happens, because God already knows that that's what's going to do.
But it matters to us. Should
I mean,
anyway.
it matters to us in the moment, but it affects us in terms of how we feel about it. But we didn't really have any power to control any of that. And if we didn't have the power to control any of it, then we really don't have any responsibility about it either, because it wasn't in our power or our control in the first place.
I've always thought that God doesn't micromanage human behavior. That God accepts us as imperfect. We try to be the best we can be, but we make errors, we commit sins, but God can live with that. We have to live with ourselves. And rather than having shackles on you, giving you no free will, it's better to give you free will, but not to micromanage everything you do.
Correct. And that's part of Rabbi Artson's argument, is that what God does is God presents us with choices. Either we can act according to God's will or not according to God's will. But we are free to make that choice. And, whichever choice we make leads to the next choice, which we can follow God's will or not follow God's will, and so on down the line. That every choice leads to another choice. But our decisions affect what the future choices are. We got really deep there. Whew.
Well, I just want to say I'm kind of, as I study and learn more Jewish thought and Jewish theology, my thoughts about God are changing a lot from what I was brought up. And I'm kind of glad that I don't think that God is like this perfect being anymore, because then if he's not perfect, then that allows him more grace when I'm not perfect, I think. Because if somebody's perfect, they expect perfection from everybody else, which, so I, for one, am glad of that.
Look, I think we strive to do the best we can do, and we strive to follow God's will in our relationship with God, even if sometimes it's not entirely clear what God's will is. And so we make the best decisions we can, but it's always going to be a challenge at every moment. You guys had a choice to come and learn today or not. You guys made the choice to come and learn, and that led us to a good discussion and hopefully something to give you some thought about, and to move you in your spiritual journey moving forward. If you had not come, you wouldn't have had this conversation, and you would have had other choices to make down the line, and that would have been fine too. But I'm personally glad you all came today.
Me too.
So thank you for being here.
You, Rabbi.
Thanks for learning
Thank you for
together.
having this
Wishing
class.
everybody a good week, and God willing, if I don't see you before then, I'll see y'all next Thursday.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks, bye.